Thank you for joining us today for addressing COVID-19 through LEED projects and sustainability objectives. My name is Brandy Burdeniuk. I'm the Chief Customer Officer of GBCI Canada, the sister organization to the Canada Green Building Council. We have 1.5 hours together today, and I'd like to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way before I go into introductions. Please note that this webinar is taking place August 13th, 2020. We know many technical questions are still being investigated globally. For today's discussion, I am proud to be joined by a range of industry experts with a keen interest to root this discussion in what we know today. This session is being recorded and will be shared with all those that registered. We have about 100 people registered that are joining us today. This is an active webinar and we want to hear from you, so please do submit your questions into the chat box and we'll incorporate them into the discussion today. If you're watching the recording, feel free to reach out to myself, Brandy, or any of the panelists if you have additional questions. I'd like to introduce our panelists now. First, we have Brandon Malik, Director of Operations and Projects at Bentel Green Oak, Doug Weber, Co-founder and Principal of Purpose Building, Jason Manical, Practice Director of Building Analytics Team for Energy Profiles Limited, Lindsay Ostrom, Team Lead in Sustainability for Williams Engineering, Mark Hutchinson, VP of Green Building Programs and Innovation at the CGBC, and Stephen Pacifico, Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Epic Investment Services. We have some planned questions and discussion themes that we'll run through together. First, I have a question for you, Mark. Are there new resources for LEED project teams to help with recent challenges related to the pandemic?
Thanks, Brandy. And I think for this part, I mean, the idea of the session today is that really it's a discussion amongst the subject matter experts. For this part, though, it was kind of the idea of setting a common base of knowledge across everyone who's participating in this. So we actually prepared some slides. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen.
That's great.
Excellent. So, so in terms of where CAGBC is at, I mean, aside from the safety of our staff, which obviously was paramount as we got into this situation back in March, the top priority for CAGBC was really about continuation of service, making sure that we were able to continue to provide the services to our members, and for my team in particular around certification, which is what I'm going to focus on is the certification programs. And we're really lucky in a way because a lot of our staff already worked remotely from home. And as a result, we had all the tools in place like Microsoft Teams, etc. So we managed to continue to provide service uninterrupted throughout this to the marketplace. And that includes, importantly, customer service. Customer service on an ongoing basis is important to the marketplace. And then critically at this point in time, you know, people have questions around COVID and what it means for their projects. So we've been able to maintain that as well. And interestingly, our volume of customer service has gone up on the order of 250% relative to last year, but it's not actually being driven by COVID. We do see COVID questions, but the majority of the increase, the vast majority, is simply a result of continued growth in the LEED version 4 and 4.1 program. More projects reaching a stage where they're really in the weeds. They're making design decisions, etc., and they have questions. So we're seeing a big uptick in questions, not necessarily driven by COVID, but we're able to adapt to that so far, at least. So the one key message that I'd want to deliver to you guys today is that if you do have questions, COVID-related or not, reach out to us. We're here to help. So we've provided on the slide there the LEED coach email address where you can reach us and we will get answers to as quickly as we can. We've also posted a page with COVID-related information to our website. And after this, or maybe even during this session, I will post this PowerPoint so that you can find those embedded links. We're updating that information as we learn more. One of the key pieces of information on the website is a series of FAQs and some information about certification allowances. You'll notice if you go to the web page that a lot of the FAQs and allowances relate to LEED O&M rather than new construction. And that's simply because building operations really, frankly, face more challenges when it comes to the impact of COVID-19, whether it's documenting occupant satisfaction when the occupants aren't even in the building, adapting their cleaning practices, or figuring out the impact that lower occupancy is going to have on their energy use and on their scoring. So whether it's new construction or O&M, we really want to provide as much flexibility in the programs as we can, especially for those O&M projects. And just as an example of some of the flexibility that's been extended already, there's a blanket 6-month extension for O&M projects looking for recertification. And if projects maybe have energy data up until the period where COVID started to impact things, but they didn't have some pieces like a transportation survey, they can survey people now about their practices before they started working from home. So that's just an example of some of the flexibility that we are starting to show the marketplace. The second thing that you would find on our website and that I want to touch on is a series of new pilot credits that have been released that address COVID-19. Specifically, they're there to provide, on the one hand, guidance for some of the things that you maybe should be considering doing on a project, whether it's LEED or otherwise. And then importantly, providing recognition for all the extra work that people are having to do right now, given the circumstances. So if you're doing things like developing new cleaning and disinfection practices, reentry plans, et cetera, then you can be recognized for that through these pilot credits. And of course, pilot credits count as innovation points in LEED. So that's how you'd be rewarded for that. And just to touch very briefly on those pilot credits, the first one is called Cleaning and Disinfecting Your Space. This pilot credit is designed to help project teams select products that are environmentally preferred disinfectants from a list of products that are effective against COVID-19. It has to be effective. Ideally, it's environmentally preferred. So this helps identify those products. The second pilot credit provides recognition for developing a plan for reentry into the workplace. And that specifically references the American Institute of Architects Reoccupancy Assessment Tool. Third pilot credit encourages water system recommissioning. There's potentially been a period of time where the water has been sitting in the pipes. There hasn't been a lot of demand, so it's important that you consider recommissioning of that water system. And what you'll notice in these first 3 pilot credits is that they really seem O&M focused. It's about buildings that are in operation. And they really are geared towards LEED O&M projects. But if you have a BD&C project, a new construction project, and it's at the later stages of construction is wrapping up and people will be moving in at some point in the relatively near future, you can look at pursuing these pilot credits for those projects as well. So for example, you've got a building that's going to be occupied in a month from now. You might want to think about, well, you will be thinking about, I'm sure, the plan for how people move in and how they're going to use that space. So that's, it's not a re-entry plan, but it is an entry plan. So you could consider that. The last thing I wanted to mention for the pilot credits was the pilot credit for indoor air quality. Now, this one is specific to LEED O&M projects. You couldn't pursue this for new construction projects. It really provides some general best practice guidance on things like filtration maintenance, fresh air rates, etc. Now, we know that the exact role of ventilation in reducing the spread of COVID-19 is really still a subject of some debate. The science is still evolving, but we do see tenants and landlords taking this very seriously. We also recognize that what you can do, what you should do, and how that varies from building to building and from space to space within that building is really important considerations. And when we were speaking with the marketplace subject matter experts with our technical advisor group, that's one thing that they really want to stress is we can't point to any general guidance that will apply to every building in every situation. You really have to understand your building, your spaces within that building, and how your building operates throughout the year, throughout the heating and cooling seasons, for example. So that's important to emphasize. Again, details of the pilot credits are on our website. And I want to take just a second here to provide some clarity for people, because of all the issues related to COVID-19, one of the ones that is creating the most questions for us on the customer service side is around the choice of disinfectants that are used. Within LEED, there was already a green cleaning credit, as you probably know. There's also now a pilot credit for using disinfectants that are effective against COVID-19. And that's creating some confusion. So here's the Coles notes, the really short version for Canadian projects specifically. When you're thinking about the credit, the easiest way to earn this credit is to look for products that meet the UL 2794 standard. That's not actually listed in the requirements for LEED, but this is like a Canadian equivalent, and that will be recognized. For the pilot credit, what you want to do is use products that are approved by Health Canada as effective against COVID-19, and there's a link in there to those products. Because they're approved by Health Canada, you know that they're available in Canada, and you know that they're compliant in Canada. So that's the list to use. And then you want to make sure that the active ingredients that are used in those products meet the EPA's Design for Environment program. So that's just to make sure that these products don't have any ill effects on the environment. Now, we're going to be posting this guidance to our website soon and communicating that in other ways. Again, if you have any questions, if you think you're in a situation where you can't find products that comply, reach out to us and we will help you. So the last thing that we speak about on the website that I want to emphasize and put a little time into was ARC Reentry, which is a series of tools within the ARC platform, which is the online building benchmarking system that is the backbone for LEED operations and maintenance under version 4.1. And what these tools do is, first of all, they allow you to document and benchmark your infection control policies and procedures. So it allows you to assess basically what you're trying to do with your policies and procedures. Secondly, to collect and analyze related occupant experience. So this is important. This is, you have these policies, but what are occupants seeing? What are they experiencing? What is the action? And again, as you know, ARC is about measuring real outcomes, what's actually happening. So it's important to get those occupant experiences in this time. The third thing that these tools allow you to do is to really measure and track indoor air quality beyond some of the measures that were always in our total volatile organic compounds and CO2. And the great thing about this is that collecting this information using ARC Reentry can really help you get going on some of the LEED Safety First pilot credits that I just spoke about, as well as WELL's Health Safety Rating, which is another great tool at this time. So the way that the ARC Reentry system works, ARC is about benchmarking, it's about scoring and evaluating. So not surprisingly, there's a score for your ARC Reentry data that you enter. And the score is the average of your performance in 3 areas: your infection control policies and procedures, your occupant experiences, and your actual IAQ results. Now, it's important to understand that just like benchmarking energy use or occupant satisfaction, this isn't a one-time thing. It's supposed to be iterative and allow you to track what occupants are experiencing, what air quality actually is, go back, make changes possibly to your policies and procedures, and then see how that evolves over time. The way that ARC Reentry is administered, what you actually experience when you go and you try to use these tools is that there'll be a series of surveys, basically. The first are around your infection control policies and procedures. These are simple yes/no questions. Do you have plans and procedures, and what do they address in terms of communications and signage, cleaning and disinfection, occupant screening, etc. The second series or survey and series of questions is really for the occupants. Questions like, are you satisfied with the building space, which has always been core to the ARC scoring. But then new questions like, is there disease control signage that you see? Is there occupant screening when you walk into the building? Do you have access to hand washing and disinfection where you are in the building and in different spaces? So this really starts to get down to finer level of detail and provides the owner and the landlord information about what people are experiencing in different parts of the building and provides some granularity there. And then the last thing is IAQ, where again, ARC has always measured CO2 and TVOC. There's new measures for other IAQ measures that are relevant to the spread of COVID-19, like relative humidity and particulate matter in the air. So the way this is evaluated is based on the fraction of the occupied space that you're monitoring, that you're testing, and how often, how frequently you're testing. So depending on your results and how much coverage you have, you'll get a different score. So that's a little bit of information about ARC Reentry, which I think is a great tool for building owners and operators. Again, key message from CAGBC, because you're not going to hear too much from me during the rest of this panel session, is we're here to help. The address is leadcoach@gbcicanada.ca. That's it for me. Thanks, Brandy.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. And we'll be sure to share all those PowerPoint slides with attendees as well, just so that you can capture all the links and resources that Mark just shared with us. So the next question I have is actually for Stephen and Brandon. I'm curious, how do LEED projects in your portfolio compare to non-LEED projects during the pandemic? And have you seen LEED certified buildings have any advantages in adapting for health and safety concerns?
So I'm unmuted, so I'll go first. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, Stephen.
Yeah, so I think our LEED properties were actually better prepared from an air quality cleaning standards. They're more in line with our COVID protocols. We have had to make some enhancements according to the COVID science, especially on like our HVAC control systems. But it was much easier to implement the COVID protocols in our LEED properties because, they already had plus MERV 13 filtration plus MERV 13, and they're already in the habit of doing indoor air quality and water testing. So for example, when we would have tenants say, well, can you give us documentation to show us your air quality and water testing? We already had those on hand. We were prepared. So it did help. But just to say too, there's a bit of a difference between our LEED buildings, which are, typically more Class A, where we have some other, smaller Class B and C buildings in more suburban areas, with a totally different investment strategy. But, so we had to do some more work on those properties, but but overall our LEED properties were very well positioned. And I think it's also a good tool for us to market back to our tenants to make them feel confidence in coming back to our building because of our LEED certification status at the building. So, and Brandon, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Brandon? You'll have to unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure if as the host you were muting or unmuting us, but I will take care of that now. So agree with everything Stephen has said, of course. The one thing I would just drive home is the availability of data and information that's a result of a LEED project or a LEED certification. To give you an example, is a building operating plan or the ASHRAE 62.1 verification that we're required to prepare for a LEED certification. Having those at hand and quite available, which sometimes they are not, certainly led us to be able to implement some of those COVID measures related to outdoor air and modifying building operations to suit what the industry is suggesting as best practices. So kind of in addition to what Stephen was saying on the MERV side and IAQ side, it was just having that documentation in a folder available to grab and use easily.
Excellent. Great points, both of you. Keeping sort of in that same realm, has the pandemic changed plans for LEED certification and other sustainability initiatives? I know, Stephen, in previous discussions, you were commenting on just waste streams that you're predicting might change a little bit. Would you like to speak to that? And then Brandon, if you have any additions?
Yeah, so it has and it hasn't. Like for our LEED certifications, we're still pushing forward on all of our recertifications and ongoing. we're in the process of migrating from LEED V4 to V4.1 performance pathway across the whole portfolio. And, you know, we're very keen. Our clients still expect this. Our tenants still want this. So we're very thankful to LEED for the flexibility they're providing us in these very challenging times. I think, you know, something that's a real struggle for us right now is occupancy. We just not have seen what we thought was the trajectory of reoccupancy at our properties. We're still hovering around 10%. We thought it'd be maybe around 25% by this time. We are expecting maybe up to 50% in September with back to school, but the verdict is still out. But yeah, we're still pushing forward. As for other sustainability initiatives, we're definitely having to rethink our strategy, especially in terms of tenant engagement. You know, as we don't have an audience at our properties anymore, we're having to totally rethink the way we engage our tenants. And there's a real shift from kind of the environmental speaking points or attributes or benefits of the building to health and well-being. And we're really, the thing that I think is the toughest question for us to answer right now is how to reconcile our energy and climate goals with, you know, all the increased energy usage we're going to need to have at the property due to increased HVAC usage and air filtration, and waste management is also another challenge because, you know, there is just no really viable recycling for the personal protective equipment other than reusable masks. So, you know, we do, and also with food, a lot of people are, you know, doing takeout and bringing in more food containers into the organization. That's kind of a challenging behavior change question. So it's definitely, we're having to rethink a lot of things, reset our baselines because we don't have occupants. And we were really fortunate. One big thing that happened that we did, I think, very well early on was when the emergency orders happened, we shut down all systems that were non-critical within the building to save energy and utility costs for 20 to 30% during that period. It's starting to ramp up back now. We're starting out, you know, our systems are starting to work more closer to normal. But that was a big benefit and a credit to our operations team for the hard work that they did to achieve that.
That's great, Stephen. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Brandon, do you have similar experience with you and your team?
Certainly a similar experience in that LEED certification is not going to change. Our strategy on that's not going to change. It remains a part of the suite of green building certifications that we will maintain in our portfolio. What I think may be added to that is more of a focus on health and well-being, like WELL certification and others that are out there. And those type of certifications will probably get a bit more focus for obvious reasons. But one of the great I think benefits of COVID in this world is that people are starting to talk more about health and wellness and indoor air quality. In the past, it's been difficult to engage with tenants on those sort of issues, and what we're trying to do as landlords to improve the health and wellness of their space. We're already seeing very COVID-related questions related to health and wellness, but would like to think that disclosure and that conversation will only continue as people get back to their office space. So that kind of deals with the third-party verification elements that WELL certification or LEED certification brings to the table.
Awesome. From the perspective of this change in tenants' focus onto health and safety, and maybe existing tenants or future tenants that you might have on your properties, do you think that this, to build off of your point there, do you think that this will allow for a little bit more visibility on certifications such as LEED and the strength of them? I know some people sort of jump to the quick things with LEED around sort of bicycle storage, which as people have started really cycling more here in Toronto, and I know even in my hometown of Edmonton, there's these pieces within certification that sort of have been overlooked, like material selection and how that impacts indoor air quality. Within the sort of focus on health and safety, do you think you'll be able to communicate a little bit more successfully to your tenants around the value of sort of these third-party certifications, not just LEED, but other ones that are out there? And that it might put them at ease when they do return to the office?
I certainly think so. What I'm hoping happens is they continue to ask us. And we've been talking about certifications for a number of years. We invest heavily in strategies and certifications. And it lands on deaf ears, it feels like, most of the time, because once we get a certification, we try to then share the value of that certification, the value of the work that went into that certification with our tenants. And it's aside from potential leasing advantage, there doesn't seem to be much uptick. So I think we will continue certainly communicating that and hope for more of a conversation rather than a broadcast on those certification elements.
Great, thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm on the same page with Brandon on that. Like, we have been promoting it for years. Sometimes it falls on deaf ears, but I think tenants I'm hoping tenants will be more ready to have that conversation now, because there are so many health and well-being attributes to being in a LEED certified property. So I'm hoping that conversation becomes more robust with the tenants, but it's something we've been doing all along as well.
Wonderful. So I'm gonna speak to Lindsay, Jason, and Doug. Lindsay, maybe to start, are there new challenges for LEED projects? And are you finding new challenges that differ between BD&C and existing properties for O&M?
Well, from what we've heard in terms of sort of short-term impacts, it does seem to be more on the existing building side rather than the new design and construction. So, regardless, there have been some regional differences in terms of, immediate changes, workplace shutdowns and that type of thing. But in general, from what we've heard, there hasn't been the same type of slowdown or interruptions or challenges on the new construction side or in terms of design of new spaces. And the existing buildings, that's where obviously there have been challenges. I think the challenge is both dealing with the impact of very quickly, people vacating buildings and having to respond to that very immediately. But now I think it's trying to plan around a return to occupants, but in that partial stage, which is really challenging a lot of our sort of built-in assumptions around how we use spaces, our occupant behaviors and all of that. And so it's trying to figure out, how do we adapt our procedures, how do we adapt our approach when we're not exactly sure, what those behaviors are going to look like. So I think that's where there's a lot of challenges. For example, you talked about bike use. So if we're still looking at, very low percentage occupancy of buildings, but perhaps we're going to see more commuters using active transportation, does that mean that there's going to be more of a challenge for use of change rooms and shower facilities? And so what does that mean, both in terms of your housekeeping procedures, disinfection, and also water use? Do you have to maintain social distancing? Do you actually not have access to use all of your facilities? So that there's all kind of challenges, both in terms of, primary challenges in dealing with infection risk, but also those secondary challenges because we're changing how we inhabit and how we use our buildings.
Great points. Can I invite Jason and Doug to add to Lindsay's points there?
Sure. I'll jump in, Jason. I think certifications have always acted as an indicator of quality. I mean, just maybe backing up a little bit to your earlier question about how are certifications being seen in the market as a result of this change, and I think they've always been an indicator of quality. It's one of the reasons that clients take them on. That's one of the reasons that tenants are interested, both in terms of the systems, the physical systems, and in terms of the management. And I think that's held up pretty well in the pandemic, that people feel more confident if the building is certified. But I think it's also caused the market to dig a bit deeper to understand, is the certification actually delivering results? And much of what we do is use proxies for what we really care about. You might even say that an energy model is a proxy for energy performance. And I think one of the ways that I've seen LEED evolve over time is that we are getting better at measuring what matters. We're usually still a couple of steps removed from the real thing we care about, but we continue to focus in more on what drives performance. And I think that the pandemic will likely and already is accelerating that to an extent, and given that there's more scrutiny in terms of is this delivering what we care about? And particularly in the realm of health and wellness, where probably we were a little further behind in terms of measuring outcomes. So I think that's an interesting shift that we should be seeing as a result of this.
Thank you, Doug. Jason, are you seeing similar shifts?
Yeah, it was something I was going to pipe in at the end of the last point, and building what you just said, Doug, that it's I sense that there's been there had already been pre-COVID a big interest in and uptake of new health and wellness certifications, and I think that those were resonating a little bit more with a lot of tenants than the green building certifications were. And I'd always personally been a little bit worried that the focus would shift so far to the health and well-being side that we lose touch with the stuff that matters most for the planet. And I've always really appreciated the way that LEED tries to balance both of those aspects. But I totally agree with Doug that the way that that LEED was historically trying to capture indoor air quality and indoor or health and well-being aspects was not very performance based. Mm-hmm. And so as that shifts more to real outcomes, I think that we'll be able to kind of maintain focus on the system LEED that balances what's good for people in buildings with what's good for the planet.
Mm-hmm. Great points, thank you. To build off of that, I'm wondering, within the continued interest in other key performance indicators that we could focus on, have you seen a continued interest in embodying and operational carbon alongside emissions reductions? I know that there's, of course, a lot of competing interests for what people are targeting to achieve for 2020, but is that interest in carbon reductions still strong, do you find? Maybe I'll start with Jason.
Yeah, I think certainly. I don't think that the pandemic has impacted the steady shift towards a focus in emissions. It's interesting, I thought we might get into normalization a little bit. I think at some point we should talk about that. It's interesting that we've seen in the past. Stephen talked about how much less energy their buildings have been using since the start of lockdown, and I hear a lot of concern within organizations like Brandon and Stevens about whether people are going to take the foot off the gas in the next little while, because they've been saving so much energy and carbon emissions over the last little while, and what's that going to do to people's plans for driving continued performance improvements. And it's particularly interesting, I think, on the carbon emission side of things, because on the energy side of things, with Energy Star and ARC, we are normalizing, but in most carbon emissions accounting, there's no normalization, and therefore people are going to see a big drop in their emissions this year. And yeah, so the big challenge, I think, is for people to, with limited bandwidth in everyone's organizations, try to keep the pressure on to keep improving building performance and carbon emissions.
Stephen, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, I'll just say, just to reinforce Jason's point, I'm like Epic in our organization, and I think a lot of my counterparts, we are not pulling the foot off the gas pedal. I think COVID is it's a moment in our history that highlights something that's very important for all of us. It's a lesson for all of us. That we need to be better stewards of the environment, and we need to be better stewards of society. And so I think carbon is the next, it's the pandemic that we've all been facing for the last 20 to 30 years. And I am 150% resolved to work as hard as I can to create the lowest carbon portfolio that I can possibly create. I'm developing a science-based carbon target as we speak. I'm looking to halve my emissions within a decade, aligned with Paris. I think this is super important, and I think it also helps us manage things like the pandemic in much more effective ways in the future. So I think we all need to be resolved in the green recovery, because we need to do business better, period. And we need to do it for people, and we need to do it for the planet. And there is definitely challenges for sure, reconciling, increased HVAC usage and whatnot. But I have never been more certain in my life that sustainability and low carbon is the direction that we really need to go and accelerate as much as we can, even during a pandemic. So I think we need to do it even more so because of the pandemic. So that's how that's where my mind is at, and that is the comment I'm trying to talk with all of my colleagues and everybody that will listen to me. So.
Fantastic, Stephen. And I would say that's completely on side with what we're seeing with sort of the language around building back better, not getting back to normal, but taking this as an opportunity to really continuously improve on what we've built up till now. And almost looking at this pandemic as training wheels for what we will see for impacts on climate change for populations around the globe. So really, really happy to hear that commitment continues. And I can see a lot of nodding heads on the screen, which makes me think that everybody also is in agreement. Before we move on, I was curious, just Doug and Lindsay, within the context of the work that you're doing, are you seeing renewed interest in carbon emissions or continued interest in the sort of emissions profile with the customers and clients that you work with?
I think we're seeing like a continuation. I wouldn't say it's renewed interest, but just there was sort of a slow building interest in this. And again, looking at sort of a long-term, how do we change the entire buildings industry? How do we change our sector? And as you said, we've talked about this, how it's really an opportunity. And I think it's recognizing that these sudden changes, again, in how buildings are used and how they function, that it's challenging a lot of the assumptions that we have made. And so I think it's really a bit of a wake-up call, both for us in terms of how we approach the design of buildings, the construction of buildings, the operation of buildings, the use of spaces within buildings, to really look at, how do we adapt those assumptions given different circumstances? And so this was a bit of a wake-up call under the pandemic, but we could have similar things looking at climate change risk of, if there are, renewed forest fire issues, what impact does that have on outdoor and indoor air quality?
Mm-hmm.
If we're looking at temperature, extreme temperature with heat waves, how do we adapt to that? And I think this has been a bit of a wake-up call in terms of how do we adapt to these, what I will call non-emergency but still urgent issues that just, psychologically as humans, we're actually not very well developed on how to react to those. We react to the urgent things. But it's the sort of the longer term. How do we keep people engaged? How do we sort of maintain the momentum? How do we keep the foot on the gas for both, you know, human wellness and for the planet? So I think that's where this is really sort of making us re-examine some of those assumptions about how we do our jobs and how we approach buildings, to really make sure that what we're doing makes sense for people and makes sense for the long term.
Excellent. Thank you. Doug?
Yeah, I mean, you know, our business is carbon is one of the core elements that we've been focusing on, and it has definitely continued to accelerate. I think we want to change our analogy about putting our foot on the gas, maybe, but I think it's kind of funny.
More wind in the turbine? I don't know.
Analogy.
So a couple of comments. You know, one of the things that is interesting is that, to Jason's point about normalization, I think I absolutely agree with the point, but it's also intriguing as time horizons get shorter and the pace gets quicker. And we're working with the City of Toronto now and all of their owned assets and developing a plan to get them to zero by 2040. That is a very short time horizon to be moving. And the difference in absolute carbon and carbon intensity, when you get to zero, there is no difference. So I think, you know, part of this is about if we really shorten the timelines where they should be and take the pace that we can, I think that becomes less of a concern. But I agree that in the shorter term, that's an issue. You know, I think I would, you know, maybe just to relate a story. This is coming from investors and boards. That's where the motivation is coming from right now. We're dealing with one large client who, you know, has been in the business for, you know, 20 years and said, you know, we always knew that the focus on carbon was coming, but it always felt like it was a few years away. You know, we're going to be dealing with it soon. And now it feels like it's months away. And he's saying the number of questions that I'm getting from our board about what are you doing? What's our plan? And so we're getting that from a number of clients who there's just a real renewed sense of urgency that this is going to catch them if they don't have a plan and start moving on it. So we're seeing it, you know, building scale, portfolio scale, and new districts, and it does seem to be moving really quickly.
Thank you, Doug. Brandon, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, just to elaborate on one thing Jason said at the end of his short talk there was the bandwidth piece, and I think that's very important to consider in this conversation. Because although there's still certainly a desire, and I want to applaud Stephen for everything he said there, there's certainly a desire, I was just going to say to keep your foot on the gas, but certainly a desire to keep moving the ball forward, let's say. There, at least across our organization, this has had a dramatic impact on everyone's jobs. And I'm not talking about productivity, I'm talking about the additional effort that's required to operate a building, and the changes that are being made to the industry on an ongoing basis, and some of the people challenges I'm sure we're all experiencing. So that bandwidth piece is really important to consider, because COVID's been a huge distraction when it comes to the kind of the meat and potatoes of reducing carbon. And so certainly the desire is still there organizationally, and I think passion-wise for the individuals, but it's the time has not increase with COVID. We are actually finding ourselves with much less time to tackle some of those things.
Yeah, I definitely like to reinforce that point. I think there is COVID burnout is a real thing. I think we put so much additional pressure on our operations teams to produce and perform according to our COVID protocols and keep doing everything else that they do. And they really need to be applauded as the heroes in our industry for the things that I've had them do that they've done without even, you know, questioning me. around COVID pandemic response protocols, but also keeping all the sustainability active at the same time. It's a tremendous effort. And I think a lot of us, including myself, are exhausted, quite frankly. You know, I think we do need to, talking about health and well-being, we're all going to need to manage this as well for ourselves in the industry, because it has been a challenging time.
Absolutely agree, Stephen. And across the board, if we can see any silver lining with the pandemic, it's the collective opportunity for all of us to sort of slow down a little bit, take note of what matters, and really be clear about where our focuses lie, both professionally and personally. So thank you to that point. One of the things that I know we had a short discussion around is just sort of tenant expectations around performance, and the thought that maybe with an unoccupied building, you'd end up with lower consumption. But as people are starting to look at building performance and how it's changed, whether it's increased airflow, additional HVAC hours, increased fresh air, all sorts of humidity concerns, are we seeing that consumption change with occupancy, whether it's lowered occupancy or changes to the HVAC system? I'm going to open that up to Lindsay first, and then Jason and Doug.
Well, we've talked about that a little bit, just that there's tension between energy and carbon emissions reductions and interior, you know, indoor air quality, occupant comfort, et cetera. And so I think right now it's just really trying to find that balance, dealing with those challenges. And that when we look at building performance, you know, shut down to absolutely vacant and versus fully occupied, you know, that's sort of black and white. We're in a lot of gray area right now, and it's trying to figure out how do you manage that gray area, because if you've got very low partial occupancy, but, you know, we still need to have the lights on, we still need to run the air systems, you know, that really presents a challenge in terms of managing your building's energy performance. And I think that's where, to be quite honest, as Stephen and Brendan had alluded to, it's the building operations staff who have really managed to thread that needle and are going to have to continue trying to balance those things as those occupancies change. And, you know, again, we're using buildings differently. And so we may have, you know, you may have a tenant who has expanded their hours into evenings and weekends that didn't typically, in order to reduce their staff counts during regular working hours, but still have everybody have a chance to get into the office. That changes your system schedules, or, you know, other changes that, you know, as I alluded to in terms of the staff access to bike storage. You know, how do you allow access to those amenities within your space, but still shut down the areas that aren't being used to achieve those energy savings? There's some real challenges here in trying to achieve that. And there are no easy answers. It will all be very building specific to the infrastructure that you have available, to the people that are in your space and what their behaviors are. And so it's really going to be an individual approach, both for your particular building and for that state and time, because again, we could see changes over time. You know, I think a lot of people are looking to September to see what happens when schools reopen. What changes did that lead in terms of your occupancy behaviors, et cetera?
Completely agree. And also just around knowing that we have a lot of assets that were built before cell phones. So people's expectations of what buildings are able to do, what they're able to adapt to, being able to even zone or have different controls and increased airflow or even fresh air to begin with, that's not possible on quite a few buildings. And so it's also being sure that you have an operations team that understands that sometimes you can't put a MERV 13 filter into a unit. Right.
Or sometimes you may not have a economizer to be able to bring in 100% fresh air. You may not have that capacity in your existing systems. So I think Brandon had commented on that as well, that, you know, one of the advantages of the LEED building is you have both that infrastructure in place and you have the documentation. So you can go through that and say, okay, you know, what are our opportunities here? What bandwidth do we have available? What changes do we have available to make within our building to adapt to this? And so that's where, again, document. So take what you have for existing documents and then again, make those assumptions listed. If you're changing your sequences, if you're changing your schedules, list why, because that may be different in, again, 3 months. So, have that information documented so you're able to go back, revisit it, and make changes. The science around this is still young. We want to be able to adapt to that as things change over time.
Absolutely. And to your point around the science being young, I know, Jason, you had mentioned sort of around concerns around humidification and just some of the cold climate challenges that we might see going into the winter.
Yeah, you'd asked if buildings are still using less than they were, or if they're now using more because they've changed the way they run or operate. And I think that it depends on the building type. Residential buildings are using far more energy than they were because there are more people in them and people are around during the daytime. But office buildings are, for the vast majority of the office buildings we track energy for, are still using far less than they had been, but that's going to change. And I don't think that we're yet seeing a big impact of changes in ventilation yet, but as we head into the winter, it's when building operators and organizations are going to find that they have a whole new set of challenges of how they might have been able to maintain increased ventilation through the summer in a way that they might not be able to, or certainly they're going to take a big heating and emissions hit come wintertime. So, and I've flagged that the renewed or the new focus on relative humidity and how that might impact transmission of COVID is really interesting, because humidification is something that, to be honest, we're often trying to encourage people to just do less of because it's so energy and carbon intensive. But it's something people are paying close attention to now.
Great, thanks, Jason. Within this context, Doug, do you want to make any additions before we move on?
Well, I guess the only thing I'd add is that it is one of the things we've been thinking about is what do you do when you have a bunch of empty buildings? How can you take advantage of the fact that you have a bunch of empty buildings? So I think there are some of our clients are trying to use this opportunity to make improvements. We got one client where we're helping them expand the use of fault detection across their portfolio, and these odd operating sequences actually make that even more valuable. We're picking up operational issues and that are even more critical. Another is trying to drive energy savings across their portfolio, and I get Stephen's comment about bandwidth, so we're trying to manage that. But there is, there are some opportunities for longer term building a value through this time.
Excellent. Sir, go ahead.
Just that I think that we've seen a keen interest lately in new technologies for monitoring numbers of people and locations of people within buildings, which it will be incredibly useful on many fronts related to what's going on these days. I mean, if we are going to take a hit in energy and carbon by extending operating hours and ventilation rates, if we're going to do that in as focused a way as possible, we want to really know where the people are in the building and how many there are. So technologies for counting and sensing people will be really useful there, and trying to figure out, trying to calculate building performance and normalize things like Energy Star and ARC and normalize energy use intensity. Those all require some count of how many people are in the building, some measure there, and really no one has. It's really hard to pin down how many people are in the building these days, and so we're interested in that front as well.
Great point, Jason. And actually a really good segue to sort of maybe have the conversation shift a little bit to, are we measuring what matters? And are there certain, I know that prop tech leading into 2020 was supposed to be one of the big shiny things to discuss in all avenues, and it's tied to sustainability. It was finally getting good and tight. But the data streams that are emerging that are relevant during this pandemic, are we measuring what matters, and what technology could we be utilizing to get us the data that we want, whether it's people counters or thermal imaging or things like that? What are you seeing?
Well, I think on the positive side, it's now clear that building operations impact people. I think that we've kind of crossed that, which I think is that's the opportunity. The problem, as I said earlier, is that we tend to measure proxies rather than real performance. And maybe as an obvious example is anyone who's implemented LEED O&M, you'll know that running fans does not mean is not the same thing as bringing in outdoor air. And I think so we want to be careful that we're achieving the outcomes we want. Mark talked about ARC Reentry at the outset, and I've been a fan of ARC. I've also been a critic of ARC, but I think the concept of it is really smart, and I do think it's getting better. And I think ARC Reentry is an example of that, of trying to measure as close as possible the things that deliver outcomes or deliver the outcomes themselves. So measuring what operators do, what occupants are seeing, and what the air quality is seems like a pretty sensible approach to this. I think we're trying to build on that, and it's building a bit on what Jason just said. Working with clients to focus on the things that. Well, maybe just back up. We unfortunately can't measure the virus, the presence of the virus. So what can you measure? And I think it's about ventilation effectiveness, number of people, and real-time air quality. And if you can put a system in place that does those three things, I think you can get pretty close to a fair evaluation of whether the systems are delivering the performance that you need to maintain health.
Brandon and Stephen, thank you, Doug. Brandon and Stephen, from a perspective of measuring what matters, have there been shifts in focus around data collection that helps with future OpEx and CapEx decisions?
I think we're still in the discovery stage, unfortunately. Like there is a lot of prop tech out there. Our systems are not, it is not an easy thing to start measuring various indoor air quality parameters in an existing control system. It's doable, but it is not an easy thing, and it differs by building, and it differs even within the buildings by the different spaces and that sort of thing. So I'd say it's one of those that there's certainly a bit of a focus on it, but we're not yet at the point of figuring out what the technology is. And then the other, maybe it's the bigger question, is what do we do when we have that data stream? How do we control our buildings? How do we educate the people that are controlling the buildings to use that data in an effective way? Because we've been measuring IAQ parameters for years, real-time IAQ parameters for years, but they've all been one-off type products that are not integrated in the system and not used to make any meaningful change.
Yeah, I would agree. We're still in the investigation mode on our side of where we want to go. There's certain things, and I think we might be having a discussion about this a little later on in the conversation, but we're kind of moving faster towards like automation and remote building operations and door automation for a touchless experience. And those things are, I think, kind of easy no-brainers. They're things we were already thinking about and that we're kind of hyper-intensifying now. And then there's other things that we're still investigating, like ionization or UVC technology and HVAC systems, where the science to me still seems very ambiguous. I'm trying to get a clear picture of like the cost-benefit analysis of like how effective are these technologies, How should they be implemented? I'm getting, suppliers coming to me at all angles to try and sell kind of these health and well-being technologies for our properties. But they're not really giving me any really good scientific evidence of their efficacy. And sometimes they don't even make sense, like ionization on elevator, on elevator fans, that basically they're purifying the air that's going into the shaft. So it's kind of like, well, what's the, I need to see, I want to see more real evidence before making these kind of OpEx, CapEx decisions. But some of them are no-brainers. Like, we do definitely need a better handle on occupancy, having occupancy sensors, more kind of real-time air quality monitoring that's integrated with our kind of BAS systems. There are things that I definitely think we can start down the path, but there's a lot of investigation going on still, as Brandon said.
Excellent. From the perspective of, Doug, you had said something that I thought was really fantastic around ASHRAE's guidance is to turn up the fans, but your team is trying to find a better way to turn up the health with your clients. And I thought maybe you could take a couple minutes and speak to that a little bit, because I think it's a really good way to sort of make the work that our operations teams do a little bit more tangible, a little bit more focused on tenants.
Yeah, and I guess I was touching on it briefly earlier, which is this idea of measuring ventilation effectiveness, occupancy, and real-time air quality. I do think that, I sympathize with Stephen and Brandon that the pitches are coming fast and furious, and everybody's got a solution. So we are not, there isn't a clear path and a clear track record of how best to do this. But I think that we need to get out in front of it. I do, we talked earlier about this idea of do we need third-party verification of data? And I think there's two paths that the data is going to come in, and they're probably going to both happen simultaneously. But one is that you have experts that are going to say, here's the quality of your air, and you're going to have everybody carrying around their own portable air quality sensor, and they're going to be putting it online, and you're going to get crowdsourced data. And so they're both going to come at the same time. So I think we need, as operators, to get out in front of this and be, and people like Bentall have, lots of, I think they may have been leading this, but the idea of getting annual or biannual air quality assessment has been the path. Yeah, we check, and the air is decent, but I think distributed and real-time sensors are coming, and if we can tackle that and know where the people are and have something other than just that the fans are running to measure airflows, I think that would be a very powerful way to demonstrate that this building is being managed effectively. And I think that's what most of the leading management teams are working on now. How do we, first of all, what is the right approach? And then how do we communicate that we're taking that action?
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lindsay.
I was going to say, I see two trends sort of coming out of that. One, we've talked about this a lot with data, and I think there's a move now, and it is still in the discovery phase, but it's trying to sort out which data points matter in terms of being able to take that data, analyze it, and turn it into actionable decisions. So I think there's a whole sort of shift that's changing there about moving from building-oriented data points to people-oriented data points, and whether it's from within your BAS system, crowdsourced measures through using smartphone apps, even as Doug was alluding to, that there's a infinite number of data points available. So how do you filter that down and turn it into actionable decisions? The other piece that I see that just to expand on what Doug has said here is also a shift in disclosure. So we have seen that over the past few years, a move toward disclosure in terms of energy use, water use, and GHG emissions. And so I think what we may see here as well is a shift towards disclosure of health and well-being related trends or data points, et cetera, for a particular building. So I don't know what form that's going to take, but I think along with this sort of growing interest in occupant comfort in spaces, and not just indoor air quality, but other occupant comfort measures, I think there will be a push to have more disclosure, whether it's on an annual basis or an ongoing real-time basis, that occupants are going to be asking for that.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on both of the points that Doug and Lindsay were making. I think from a disclosure standpoint, we thought that it was very important to be transparent with our tenants and clients very quickly and frequently during the pandemic. And so we provided that COVID client updates on a weekly basis, basically showing energy performance and health and safety protocols that we were targeting, and also playing that back to the tenants to help build confidence in them in the way we were managing the property and are managing the property. I think it's that disclosure piece has been very, very important for our business. The other thing I want to mention too is I think a lot, and especially for everybody on the call today, I think a lot of people think, you know, maybe there'll be these grand tech solutions that will help us through this pandemic. But there are three basic things that you can design your building to work around, and that's really physical distancing, supreme good sanitization, and symptom awareness of yourself. So and promoting these three human behavior things are quite effective in controlling the spread of COVID. So, you know, if that when I was helping to lead the pandemic protocols for our company, that was the mindset I always had in designing these protocols, and obviously listening to all the health recommendations from regulators and medical officers of health and our industry association. But there are some basic fundamentals here that are very low tech, and they're effective. And we should just be implementing them, period. It's a no-brainer, and everybody should be doing it until we see our way out of this. They don't require a lot of capital. A little bit. It's different capital, but they're quite effective strategies, and I think a lot of people need to just, you know, before they're thinking about implementing all this CapEx spend, really think about what is it that you're trying to achieve. So
fantastic, Stephen, thank you. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit just to tie off of the comment around design and operation teams and how they could be rethinking how buildings are controlled within this context. And so, Stephen, you talked about sort of all this prop tech that's being pitched to you, but has there been an increased interest in remote building management systems alongside this for some of your assets that have that capability?
Yeah, definitely. We were already moving down the path, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, of remote building management systems. And you know, we feel very lucky to have partners like EPL and other partners in our supply chain that have been helping us down this path to control and monitor performance of our buildings from anywhere, which adds another layer of protection to our operations staff. And can help them do real-time management of the buildings. We're also looking at AI-enabled HVAC and BAS control systems, fault detection, and all that kind of stuff as well. Which I think, you know, I think there's still some work. There's still some work that needs to be done there to prove out the efficacy of these systems. But for sure, we're looking at occupancy sensors, air quality sensors, UV or ionization technology, and kind of a touchless automated experience of our buildings. But one of the important things on the automation of doors and such is around security, is maintaining security at the property and really making sure we know who's in the building and who shouldn't be in the building. Just for traceability in the face of COVID.
Brandy, you're muted.
Thank you. Brandon, are you seeing on the Bentall Kennedy side similar similar prop tech remote management systems being investigated or already implemented?
Yeah, we're there when it comes to managing the buildings remotely. One of the challenges we had is we had 24/7 operations for some of the buildings were built, and from a cost effectiveness perspective needed to move away from that. So that's been, I'd say, in place for a year or two. And now Stephen was alluding to the AI type conversations are happening now in that prop tech world. So those are early stages, and we're doing a couple pilot projects in one of my properties I manage, but it's still very early days on the AI side.
You're muted again, Brandy.
Goodness. Lindsay, Jason, and Doug, from your perspective, are you seeing any technologies that have you excited for not just managing pandemic concerns, but also potentially improving the performance of these assets across a portfolio?
I was going to build on what Stephen and Brandon were just talking about in your last question about building operations. It's kind of part of what we do and it's something that people have been forced to do over the last few months. I mean, they've been had so much of their property management and operations how to run these buildings with most of the people not there.
We're getting a little bit of feedback, so those that aren't talking, if you could mute. There we go.
So people are, even the ones that weren't heading in that direction, are quickly figuring out how to run a building when most people aren't there with feet on the ground. But then there's this other bit related to what we were talking about before about occupant experience and the new ways in which we're going to run buildings. That the people at the building are the ones that know the tenants best and interact with the tenants or the occupants directly. And that's a challenge that the industry needs to figure out. Is there's definitely a shift towards more automation and more centralized operation of buildings and building systems, and maybe that means having people at the building shift more from operations to simply to maintenance. And yet you still need people at the building who will talk to the occupants and understand what's going on for them. We're seeing that with a new focus on ventilation effectiveness, that along with that has come a push in some organizations for really rigid comfort boundaries. Like, we're going to start keeping everything at 22 degrees. And then I hear building operators say, but the tenants don't want it at 22 degrees. They would rather have it at 24 or 25 degrees. And now I'm being pushed to keep it colder and use more energy than I was before. And so I think that's an interesting a challenge that we're facing as we head on this path towards more automation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason.
Well, I think Stephen made a good point too, is that technology is not the savior necessarily. You know, we have a lot more tools available in our tool belt, but it still comes down to people. So it's the operations people, it's the occupants themselves. And so I do think that it's more trying to make sure that we're using technology and using those tools in order to get that feedback, right? So whether it's, you know, that occupant engagement and finding out where there are concerns and making sure that that comes back to the building operations staff so they're able to adapt accordingly, whether it's using, you know, real-time measurement to get quantitative data for that so that you can make decisions that way. But it's only the tool, it's not the end goal. So we're only using technology, I think, where it makes sense, and really making sure that whatever that interaction is specific to that particular building and those particular occupants.
Excellent, Lindsay. Thank you. Doug?
Well, I don't have much to add to that. That pretty much captures it, but I'll just trot out a bit of a tired expression, but it's technology is the answer, but what is the question? is where, as we all know that I don't think it's, I don't think there's a shortage of pitches on technology, but there is a shortage of service offerings that effectively combine technology and people, and I think that's that's what we're focused on.
Certainly. Within that context, are there any key resources that you found helpful, either professionally or personally? I'll shoot this question out to all of the panelists here. Stephen, would you like to go first?
Sorry, I was distracted. Can you repeat the question?
Certainly.
An important email came through. I'm just being fully transparent.
It happens. Life happens. I wanted to just invite everybody to share some of the key resources that you found helpful, whether it's professionally or personally. Just there's so many out there. Maybe just as a filter through the panel, which ones you found most helpful?
Well, I'll just be very general on this, but I'll just have to say I'm impressed with the Canadian commercial real estate industry and my sustainability colleagues. We have been so collaborative. Our industry associations such as RealPAC and BOMA and Green Building Council have been so supportive and so helpful. It feels like I feel like a part of a community where I can pick up the phone and call any one of my counterparts at any organization and ask them how they're dealing with this HVAC issue. And without reservation, they'll give me full transparency and support, or lobbying efforts with the industry associations for the green recovery. Or I've just been touched and impressed by how collaborative the industry has been throughout this. It's helped me move very, very quickly in addressing sustainability concerns and also building pandemic protocols at work for our tenants. So, but I've been kind of everywhere. I've been using all like ASHRAE and my suppliers and health, all the medical officers of health recommendations from all the various government institutions. I was charged to kind of help lead with a lot of our pandemic response across all North America. So I was quite engaged with a variety of different stakeholders. And but I have to say, what's been happening here in Canada has, and with our colleagues in the industry, is impressive of the response in the commercial real estate sector.
I would echo that, Stephen. I feel pretty lucky that I get to go to work every day in this industry. There's a lot of really smart people working really hard to find solutions that are quite diverse. So good to see. Doug, Lindsay, Jason, Mark, are there any resources that you have come across that you would like to share?
I mean, I think I guess maybe just rather than a resource, an approach, we've really focused on trying to be clear about what is known and what is speculation, because I think it has been fascinating how quickly ideas travel through the market that really are not fully vetted. On the flip side, I'd also say it's interesting how quickly some ideas turn into accepted facts. Remember when masks weren't seen as necessary, as an example. And I think that is what Stephen made a great point about how he was handling this in the early days in his organization. I think there's been some interesting analysis of where the pandemic has been handled well, and it is about over communicating and admitting what you know and what you don't know. And so I think that's we're trying to follow that lead, and I think it is the Chief Medical Officer of Health here and other regions that we certainly look to as trying to wade through all of the new data that's coming in and make decisions. And I don't envy their position in having to decide what the right path forward is, and deal with the constantly changing information.
Certainly. Others on the line? Would you like to weigh in?
Well, I think that there's a good point there too, just in terms of, we know that things will change over time. Again, the science is new, the evidence is still emerging. And so again, I think documenting your decisions so that you can go back and revisit them. You know, what was the basis of that decision? If it was guidance from a public health agency, from, you know, even those documents have been updated over time. So even just in terms of record keeping, you know, this recording, even our discussion today, it's August 13th today, so it's based on what we know today. And so we're making decisions, you know, the best decisions that we can at the time based on the available evidence and the available guidance that's been provided. And so I think it's important when we're communicating that we're keeping that record to say, okay, well, we've made this decision based on this available information, and you know, keep a copy. This is the reason we did it, because 2 months from now, they may issue an update that says something different. So, you know, not that you need to cover your butt, but just so that you can understand, if we're looking back in hindsight to try and learn some of these lessons, we understand why decisions were made at those times. And if they were changed, again, what was the rationale behind it? So I think that we are having to sort of wade through a period of uncertainty and changes in approaches or changes in the guidance. And so it's just understanding how to manage that uncertainty, but still make the best possible decisions.
Great points, Lindsay. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I'm just going to say it's such a great point, because like I think I'm on draft 7 or 8 of our pandemic protocol, and we reissue the draft to our tenants and clients at every version. You know, in early days, like we thought all the PPE would have to be biohazard waste. And then we quickly realized that it could just go in the normal waste stream. And so it was about documenting, just as Lindsay said beautifully, and then communicating and making sure people know the different iterations. So.
Absolutely. Well, we have about 8 minutes left here. I'm going to remind everyone that's on the call to submit your questions in the group chat. I'm going to start with one that's more of a general question, but interesting, because I haven't seen this yet. This is coming from Andre, asking about, oh goodness, there we go. Andre Dufort asking that they heard in this past week that some cities are starting to measure COVID indicators in wastewater treatment facilities to evaluate areas of virus outbreak. They're wondering if there's anything of this kind on the radar for building systems. Have you heard of anything? I haven't. No, interesting. All right, so we have some homework to do. Thank you, Andre. Stephen, have you?
I've heard that it's a very good mechanism to detect the virus, and there's potentially that could be a transmission vector as well in washrooms. Yeah. But I haven't heard about testing it in buildings yet.
Yeah, very interesting. Good question, Andre. Thank you. I'm wondering, while we wrap here, Stephen and Brandon, with an increased focus on wellness, do you think a positive outcome could be a better educated pool of tenants and a shift in the brokerage community to understand the importance of indoor air quality?
Certainly, I think that is happening. It's been focused on COVID and indoor air quality up until now, but moving beyond that, there will be increased focus on indoor air quality, and so not necessarily the value of it, but what it means. Like, what are those metrics that we're using to communicate to our tenants or to the brokerage community, and how those metrics have an impact on their occupants, their staff, and their wellness and their productivity.
Do you think that we'll see indoor air quality be something that is prioritized within marketing to tenants in the future for new tenants?
I'd love to say yes. I think we're far away from that, though. Like, we're still trying to get tenants to figure out what LEED is, or sorry, the brokerage community to figure out what LEED is, let alone what a TVOC is. So I'd love to see it, but I'm a little skeptical that it's next month sort of thing.
Excellent.
Yeah, I agree with Brandon on this point. I do think we do still have a challenge of tenant engagement, and you know, tools are evolving for us to start to have better conversations with our tenants. But there's still a lot of challenges and barriers there. But I think we're going to get there. I mean, definitely the thinking is there, but I think there's a lot of improvements to be made on the tenant engagement side, just because we traditionally haven't had strong relationships directly with our occupants, but more with a tenant rep. And so it's hard to have that conversation, and we need to rethink the way we do that piece. And I think the industry is.
Excellent. Well, as we near time, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm wondering if I can invite Mark to speak on how the CAGBC and GBCI Canada has focused their advocacy efforts for the green recovery during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Brandy. I do think, as has been discussed, this is in a way an opportune time for change in the industry, right? It's regrettable why we're so closely looking at our buildings and how they operate and how they might operate in the future. But just the fact that all this attention is going into evaluating our buildings and thinking about them, I think creates an opportunity. At the same time, governments are looking to spur the economy and get things up and going again, which also represents an opportunity. And underlying all of this, both on the government side and in the owner's side, is this long-standing commitment to greenhouse gas reduction. So I think you can overlay that and we can get actually more traction. And of course, so from CAGBC's perspective, pushing for more investment in green buildings, policies that support green buildings is something we've always done. In particular, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've really increased our focus there, and in particular on retrofits. We've published a number of pieces of research, et cetera, to support the business case for why this is important. You may have seen some of the most recent research we put out, which indicated a couple of things. First of all, our industry is already sizable. We already represent about 460,000 jobs across the country, which is actually more than mining and forestry and oil and gas combined. Secondly, that represents a big contribution to GDP on the order of $48 billion annually today. And with the right policies and incentives in place to spur a green recovery, we determined that by 2030, we could be looking at another million jobs, so 1.5 million jobs in this sector, and an additional $100 billion annually contributed to GDP. So there's a huge upside to that, if you will. So we can meet climate objectives, we can meet economic objectives, and we can help meet public health objectives through green buildings. So that's something that we're trying to message to government. In May, we published a series of recommendations around the workforce and funding investment in educating the workforce on the buildings of the future, on funding retrofits in the building sector, which is an area that we've been active in for a long time and continue to be active. And there's some very positive signs there from, especially at the federal level. There's going to be significant funding potentially made available for building retrofit. And our third recommendation was that the government, the federal government, and all of governments lead by example within their own portfolio, existing buildings and new, procurement. Look at decarbonization very fast and look at being the leaders in that respect. So it's important that the industry shows support. We need data, we need numbers, we need the arguments, et cetera. We also need the industry support. So we have RAIC supporting our recommendations. We have RealPAC as well, and the Canadian Urban Land Institute, which is fantastic. And just a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, we put out a call for industry, organizations and individuals to sign up and indicate their support for these 3 areas of focus as well. And we've had a number of organizations and people do that. So if you haven't already done it, I encourage you to take a look at the information we've put out and look at signing up and indicating that you support this direction. The website for that is cagc.com/green recovery. So that's your action item for right after this meeting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. If you could put that into the chat, that link, that would be perfect as a resource. I'm also going to invite everyone to register for Building Lasting Change 2020, which is moved online and virtual. You'll be able to see Stephen Pacifico delivering a fantastic chat about thriving sustainable communities and a new ecosystem for development. So I want to thank all of our panelists today for sharing their insights and experience. Absolute fantastic knowledge that you shared with us today, and really, really good insights into what you're seeing. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be sharing a link for all of you to view and share with your teams. And remember, you're not alone in this. If you have LEED certifications that are ongoing right now and you have some questions, you can reach out to myself, Brandy, or Mark, our LEED coach teams, which we'll put that email address in here. If you haven't connected with our LEED coach teams, they're quick to respond and they're fantastic and helpful. And then those questions get tied to your actual project that's being certified. So thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful week. Thank you, everyone.
Ready.
Thanks, Brandy.
Thanks, Brandy. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.